right, man. Everyone is really interested at the moment. It's trending, Israel-Palestine war. Every news media is reporting on it. And I suppose, a lot of people are being questioned, especially in New Zealand with the electoral candidates. What's your position? And so, I think for a lot of people in the younger generation, I personally didn't know what the backstory was, how to pick a side, or even how to understand the scenario. So we were talking to people at Unitech, about the elections. And so the one Palestinian we bumped into, not knowing he was, questioned us. He was like, are you for Palestine or are you for Israel? And then he began to kind of unpack the history of the conflict. And I suppose it made me realize in that moment that there's two sides to every story. And so I thought it might be helpful to get a little bit of the history of the conflict that's taking place between these two people. So what do you have to enlighten us with?
Well, the consensus in the world with many nations is that there should be a two-state solution in regards to this conflict, because there's Palestinians who live in Israel, and they have had a level of oppression that has been imposed upon them through settlement activity, which are considered illegal by the United Nations because they go into Palestinian territory, these settlements. And so the United Nations, being the broker of that conflict, handed to them by England to broker that conflict, basically decides boundaries and so on and so forth. And they acknowledge that the Palestinians have a place in this Israel, and there's an Israeli, Jewish state also in this area. And that obviously leads to conflict because you have two people basically, and some of them feel oppressed. Some of them feel like they have a divine right to the land. Some of them feel like they've been oppressed. They've been there for a long time. And so there's conflict that ensues, And so some people offer a two-state solution. We need Palestinians to have their area and the Israelis to have their area. Some people some radical Jews offer like, no, we need the whole thing, because God has given it to us and we have a divine mandate to build Zion or whatever. They're on the extreme end of Judaism. And then you have some Arabs too on the extreme end who say, no, we need Israel to be gone, and just the Palestinian state. So, and the consensus was two-state solution, but I don't know how permanent that can be.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, just for an enlightenment of those who don't understand the conflict and how it's kind of reached this point. So obviously, the narrative that most people are aware of is the biblical narrative of the land of Israel being the land for the chosen people. And so how did it go from not being in the possession of the Israelites to now this sort of two-state, just a quick step-by-step of how we got to this conflict of war when it once belonged to Israel?
Right. The last owner of the land, the last major empire that owned that land was the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
Yes, and they not only controlled Israel, but they controlled parts of Egypt. Depends how far back you go, of course.
Because how did Israel lose control of the land
initially? They were dispersed by the Romans.
Okay.
Yes, that's how they lost the land.
All
They
right.
were dispersed by the Romans, 70 AD. Yeah. But eventually the Ottomans ended up in control of the land, not just of Israel, but of Iraq and Syria and Jordan.
And just to identify who are the Ottomans, because they're no longer actually an empire today. So who were they? Which people group were the Ottomans?
They were an Islamic empire.
Okay.
They weren't Arabs per se. It was made up of Arabs, but they were mainly Turkish.
Okay.
Yeah. And they converted to Islam when Islam came, and then they they incorporated their empire with the Islamic empire, and you had the Ottoman Empire, also called the Turkish Empire.
So did they colonize Israel while Jewish people were there, or Jewish people were not there at all? They had already been dispersed.
They were dispersed
already, so they didn't colonize Jews there.
No, the Jews were gone. It was the Roman power that was in control.
All right.
And then they made their way through to taking those areas from the Eastern Roman power.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the complicated situation.
All right.
Yeah.
So then now the Ottomans are in power. So how do we get from the Ottomans to where we are today?
Right. Long history, but we'll shorten it down to
main points. Yes.
World War I.
Okay. I'm with you right there.
The Ottoman Empire sided with the German-Austrian alliance to fight the British-French-Russian alliance. And so they had a series of wars. It's World War One. It's messy. We have in New Zealand, we talk about Gallipoli. You know how the Anzacs are fighting in the beachheads of Gallipoli, which is Turkey. You know, and fighting the Turkish Empire, and so they lose that battle, that war. Not only them, but Austria-Hungary loses, and Germany loses that war. And so Germany gets a whole bunch of repercussions. Their lands, a lot of their lands get confiscated. Austria-Hungary, they split up into the Balkan nations that you see today. They get divided, and now it's the Ottoman Empire's turn to get divided. You know, you lost, so it's France.
So who's calling the shots? England and France, because they won the war.
They won.
You play the game, yeah.
Yeah, you launched the war, you lost.
Yes, okay.
And you agreed to go into that war. Everyone did in Europe, basically.
Yes.
You know, and so they say, fine. You know, we're calling the shots. We have to honor some commitments we made to the Arabs, because the Arabs were fighting in Saudi Arabia for independence against the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So they made their commitment to the Arabs and gave them Saudi Arabia. That's when it became Arabia.
So that's a recent thing. Even though you had Arabia back in Bible times, this is now back to the Arabs.
The Arabians got their independence from the Ottomans because they lost.
Okay, all right.
So they become Saudi Arabia. Like, thank you, you know, you gave the story of a guy named Lawrence of Arabia. You know, he's a British spy person who was orchestrating rebellions and organizing the Arabs to defeat the Ottomans. So they're like, fine, you fought along with us.
So here's your perks.
Here's your perks. You know,
your reward. Yeah,
your rewards. Yeah. So the Arabs have their part there, and Iraq was divided up too into the nations that we see today, and Syria and all the rest of them. You know?
So you're telling me that Syria, Iraq, Iran included or no?
No, not Iran.
Okay. Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
were part of one vast empire called the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
So it was one empire.
Yeah.
And sort of a joint landmass in terms of ownership. And then after the defeat in World War One, it was carved up by Britain and France to be the geographical countries we see today. Those aren't the ancient Syria and ancient Babylon that were there back in the day.
No, those guys were colonized themselves. They became Arab nations afterwards, but they were interesting. They were gone. You know, the name of the agreement was called the Sykes Picot. That's the name of the treaties that divided the
land.
Middle East up. Yeah, Sykes Picot. Yeah, and during World War One, England promised the Jews that they would also get a piece of the pie, you know, but they didn't fulfill that until 1948.
And this World War One ended in 1918 from 1914, which means from 1918 all the way to 1948, they were waiting 30 years for the fulfillment of the promise.
They were saying, hey, you gave the Arabs their lot.
Very interesting.
Where's ours?
I find this interesting because it actually is a little bit of the reason with the conflict in Zimbabwe over land, because England promised those indigenous Zimbabweans land, and it was delayed for 20 years until the people then took control into their own hands, and then it was chaos, actually, which is an interesting thought.
Yep.
All right.
Obviously,
carry on.
The Holocaust happened.
Yeah.
And that was like, okay, we got to give them.
They need their place.
They need their place, sort of thing.
They wouldn't have suffered so bad if we had given them their patch of land.
They have the Jews have like persecution phobia. You know, we need our own nation because we just get
persecuted terribly
all the time. Yeah, sort of thing. Yeah. So yeah, everyone. The person who really lost was the Ottoman Empire, you know.
Because they owned all of that.
Yeah, they got divided up. You know, even Turkey was made a nation as it is through that division.
Because was Turkey the capital, so to speak, of the Ottoman Empire?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like as a remnant from the Eastern Roman Empire?
Yes.
After that split. All right.
Yes, Constantinople. It was called Constantinople. The Turks changed it to Istanbul.
Which is what we have today.
Yeah. So a lot of dividing up of land, a lot of conquests.
And so this is Britain and France calling all these shots. It's a major thing to undertake.
Yeah. They did call these shots, and eventually after World War II, they wanted to withdraw from the world. They had they're done with their colonial endeavors. So you have a whole bunch of countries gaining independence, and
all across the globe,
across
in
the world.
Africa and New Zealand,
and even France and other countries in Europe were like, okay, we messed up big time. We fight all the time. We colonize people. Maybe we are an oppressor at some level. So we're sick of that. World War II, Hitler's trying to do his thing. So they're like, okay, we're going to withdraw.
That's interesting because obviously, people condemned Hitler's somewhat colonial efforts. And so in light of that, the British, the French, the Germans, all of them, well, the Germans were already part of it, but all of them started to kind of withdraw because it was really made to look as bad as it really is through Hitler.
Yes, like Libya gained independence from Morocco. Morocco gained independence from France, and they became their own state,
Okay, so then now with the Israel patch of land, how did we end up where we are today in this whole dividing of land?
Right. England withdrew, and they said, we need a two-state solution. The Palestinians will have one area, and the Jews will have another area. And they withdrew and said, United Nations, you sort it out, basically.
So how did you end up with the population of Jews and Palestinians in the division of land in the first place? Because Jews were scattered. How did you end up with Jews there with something to inherit?
There were Jews that remained. There were remnants. Yeah, Arabs obviously were there too. There were Christians in there also. Migration. They did because they felt like that the British would give them their land. They had promised that they would. There was this whole movement of Zionism to go back to the land. So there was immigration. There were Jews that lived there because there's a big Jewish population in Iran.
Persecution in Europe would have stemmed some level of fleeing for refuge within that space anyway, because the guy we were talking to, who's a Palestinian, was saying that they harbored lots of Jewish refugees fleeing from the World War II persecution, and I'm guessing also World War One.
Yep, World War One, World War Two, migration. There were people who were remnants were there. There were people who lived in the surrounding areas. Who also mingled. Who also contributed to Israel, Palestine at that time. That area that was controlled by the Ottomans. Because it was a free flow of traffic. It was one big empire. So Jews could mingle with their brethren in Palestine, in the Palestinian territory, very easily. So at that time, I say Palestine because at the time there was no Jewish state.
There was no Jewish state. So England and France then divided it up between the Palestinians and the Jewish as a two-state solution?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did. They divided it up. Yeah. And they left the management of that to the United Nations.
Okay.
Yeah. Which then divided the land the way that it was according to whatever agreements they had. They divided it up. And that's why the United Nations can say your settlement activity is illegal, Israel. Because the land that we divided it, you're stepping above your boundaries, and that's why they can also say, wait a second, Hamas, you can't be trying to dislodge Israel because it's a two-state thing, So that's their authority in that, So that's where they come in. The United Nations comes in. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. A lot of fighting, a lot of conquest, a lot of redrawing of maps and fall of empires and the emergence of Islam and Romans, and so it's really it's
difficult.
It's
a messy situation.
I mean, conquest is the predominating factor.
Yeah.
In all this,
and obviously with that, who gets to call the shots? Because what gives legitimacy to any land, I suppose, in light of conquest? Who really gets to call the shots? Who ultimately, objectively owns any piece of land?
That's the funny thing about
given the story of humanity.
That's the funny thing about it, because the ancient Egyptians were colonized by the Arabs, who weren't originally there, and everyone colonized each other. But who are the original owners of the land? Like, you can't go back to the Ottomans because they're gone now.
Yes,
they owned it before that. The Muslim caliphates owned it before them.
People say
they're
that...
gone now.
Interesting.
How far back do you go? I mean, Adam owns everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point you make, because I'm thinking the Bible records the history of colonization of nations, but it goes with, Babylon, And then Babylon was conquered by Persia. And no one contests that, oh, the Persians should give back Babylon their empire. Well, Persia took because they won the conflict. And then Persia was conquered by Greece. Well, the Greeks owned it because they won it in the battle. And then Greece was conquered by Rome. And so, okay, no one contests the Roman ownership because they won it.
I don't see Babylon saying, we need Babylon back. That's our land originally.
So then who has the
Assyrians
original
or whatever.
title deed? Who has the original title deeds of entitlement to any piece unless you've won it?
Adam is the sole owner.
I mean, ultimately, it's
God,
God's.
yeah. He's a steward. Yeah.
And we're just stewards. And
Yeah,
obviously,
just
in our own competition for land, it's like a house. Like no one. If you lose your house, then someone else can own the house.
Yes. And the thing is, with these areas of the world, the history goes back, and you can pretty much trace it. The Assyrians owned a lot of these areas way
right.
back in time.
That's recorded in the Bible. Yeah.
And so and even but God allowed certain nations to be dislodged.
Yeah.
He said, it's not for your goodness that I'm giving you the land. It's because of how evil they are. I'm going to dispossess them.
Yeah.
And so nations do get dispossessed also. Like the Babylonians, God was like, time's up.
Okay, next.
Next. Persians, time's up.
Yeah.
Next.
And because they were conquering nations,
Yeah.
they earned theirs by conquest. And so, you have that saying by Jesus, they who live by the sword shall die by the sword. So it's just the way that game rolls of conquest, that if you want to play that game, it's eventually going to come to you as well.
Yes. That's why God gives like so much anathemas to Babylon afterwards. You're going to be, overthrown and so on and so forth, and you'll be killed with the sword, because of your crimes. So if you play that game of living by the sword, you die by it.
Yeah.
It all comes around eventually.
Yeah.
There's that retribution that happens. So if you're playing that game, be ready. If you're conquering, be ready to be conquered also. They're playing the same game as you're playing. Both sides.
Yeah.
So
do you pick a side then with the Israel-Palestinian conflict, given that this is not just a one-off instance? It goes back. Can people pick a side that is right?
It's hard. Because it depends how far back you want to go. But if we're just being objective about it, like we now have two people that exist there. And I don't think that you're going to say to Israel, pack your bags, go back to Germany, and go on your boats and back to Germany. I think Israel, it's just there now. It exists. It's entrenched there. The Palestinians are there. They exist. They're entrenched there.
Yeah.
And now they have to settle their differences. Like one side says Israel must go, one side says Palestine must go, but they're both there. They're massive populations. They were given that land through the United Nations, who had the authority to do that through Britain. The original owners before them, the Ottomans, they're gone.
Yeah.
So you're just stuck with two people there, and and now they got to settle their differences. I mean, easier said than done, obviously.
Yeah.
But I can't say. I obviously I don't condemn terrorism. No one condemns that. I mean, no one says that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the situation that they're in. But yeah, I mean, Christians weren't supposed to play by that game, right?
No.
Yeah. They were to live under any empire that they were subject to. They were to live under them and work within that empire. And the Roman Empire was vicious to Christians.
It was very crucified Christ,
and was oppressive.
Yeah.
And some people decided to revolt and play that game of sword versus sword. The Jews are going to revolt against the Roman Empire, and they're going to fight, and all these conflicts are going to emerge.
That's what led to their dispersion.
Yes, that's what led to their dispersion. But the Christians were like, Jesus was like, just flee. When you see the Roman...
Now, that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
That, because there were Christian Jews, and they were Jewish Jews, and the Jews took up the sword to fight against the Roman Empire, but the Christians took the approach of Christ.
Yeah. If they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. And don't fight for
land.
Like the Jews did want to do that. and they revolted against the Roman Empire, and they got crushed.
Yeah.
Only the Christians who heeded Christ's words, when you see these things, don't even get your coat, flee.
Just go.
Go.
It's just land. It's just stuff.
God's gonna, the meek shall inherit the earth. He promises.
There's a bigger picture to this
There is
narrative.
a bigger picture, yeah. God is in control of the succession of empires. You just be faithful to your calling, and that's to spread Christianity throughout the world and live within the empires, not to usurp them or try to set up some sort of kingdom.
That's right. That's very good. That's very interesting because, the original intent of God, even in placing the Jews there, was to influence the rest of the nations to take on the mindset and the ideology that we are actually one family. We are one family, all created by God. And, God wanted coexistence, but obviously initially the first steps for the Jews was combating, other nations. And so the initial effort was through conquest. But it was a lesson for them and the world to see that conquest never achieves what God's ideal is, because they wanted a kingdom. And then ultimately Christ, as the rightful king of Israel, said, look, we don't live by the sword because you die by the sword. Yeah. And we don't separate ourselves by blood, or race or color, because we're all children of God.
Speaking in tongues was a testament to that.
That's right.
When they started speaking other languages so that the Arabs could hear the gospel and all sorts of other people, Greeks could hear the gospel in their own language. God was saying it's not just a national thing consolidated to just the Jewish people. This is more than that. You can be Arab, you can be Greek, you can be that ethnicity, but you can still incorporate the gospel into that community. And so you have Paul working within the Greek communities and people working in the Arab communities. I know Thomas went to India. There's churches in India there too, that aren't trying to claim to be, it's now our land. It's just there's churches there, there's Christian influence there, and that's the way that it spread initially, and whenever it moves away from that, he that lives by the sword dies by
the sword.
There's just a destruction that occurs. But it's through ideas that Christianity spreads. A conversion of the heart through speaking of the word, through hearing it by faith. You incorporate that into your life, and whether there's churches in Ethiopia, there's churches all around the world.
This is very good.
Who have their own identity as an ethnic people, but they're Christian.
That's right.
And they can still incorporate that Christianity without losing the fact that they're a nation themselves.
I'm just thinking as you're speaking, that just to affirm what you're saying, that the countries that people choose to migrate to the most are Christian countries. And it's because while each country had a national identity, a racial identity, Christianity is influence within various countries like the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and the ideology of Christianity that there is no Jew, no Greek, we are all one, created by one God, meant that they become multicultural and inclusive of everyone, from all sorts of backgrounds, because that's the view of Christianity, that the culture is love God and love your neighbor. That's the culture, And so there was no separation of color, no separation of rank, the poor, the rich, all of that was taken away. And they became the countries that everyone really desired to live in because they had freedom. Yes,
New Zealand doesn't live by a racial creed. It's a lot of these countries that are tolerant towards migrants and the foreigner, they live by their laws, but there's no racial supremacy sort of thing. If you look back at the early Christian church, it was like they all had everything in common, that no one was lacking. They were a body of believers. There's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile.
So the land is for us all.
Yes, male nor female. It's not about caste. It's not about racial things or anything like that. It's about anyone who accepts Christ can be a partaker of this community, and can, regardless of any other things, you're one in that. You can be part of it.
That's right. That's profound because you see Jesus within the Roman Empire serving Romans who were their oppressors, loving Romans, healing Romans who were their oppressors, and the Samaritans who the Jews didn't want to mix with. And so it's incredible that even though you had the Pharisees that were separatist, we don't mix with those people. Jesus did good for all and then sent his followers to all nations to do good, never to bear the sword. They were not to earn any land or fight for any land. And so I know that people have, some distaste towards Christianity because in the branches that became corrupt got interested in land, or got mingled with politics. And, colonization is blamed on Christianity in many respects. And yet Christ himself never endorsed that or sent any of his disciples to fight any war, but to be there as a savior to whoever was in need.
Yes, that's exactly what Christianity was about. And it mingles with the nations that it is in contact with, and it leavens them and attempts to better them, And so there's care for the poor and rights of the worker and the rights of man and having inalienable rights created in the image of God, and the sanctity of the individual. All these ideas were leavened from Christianity, and individual rights and not being tyrannies over people. All those things was like, Christ was saying, the servant's not greater than his master, and Christianity was a faith that was persecuted heavily, and so
because they never believed in using force.
Yes, they were persecuted heavily, and in turn they should be the ones who are most accommodating for those who are persecuted.
That's right.
Because they were once in that situation, and so they would, many Christian nations, they take in refugees. Many people want to be in there now, It's like standing at the top of the castle. They say, we don't need Christianity anymore. But Christianity built up these nations that are fighting for universal rights and the privileges of those who are oppressed and not having tyrannies and all these things, human rights and all that. That's all predicated under a shared idea that man is of value. It's created in the image of God,
And God owns everything.
That God owns everything. God, man is a steward, and that there is no longer a distinction between racial and female and male and all these things. It doesn't mean you can't be accessible to the gospel, or you make that an issue, for a nation.
That's really good. Because the alternative then is the survival of the fittest, which is the evolutionist perspective, which means whoever wins the fight has the entitlement and has the last say. And so it's basically the strongest survive. So if Hamas attack Israel, if they win, good. If they lose, too bad. Then it's just about whoever is the strongest.
Yeah.
So here's a thought then, with what you said about how the land got divided, obviously, to just kind of now get to the Israel issue. So Israel is entitled to the piece of land they were given because Britain and France earned ownership as the previous conqueror earned their ownership. And so they're entitled to it because they were given it by the conquerors. And Palestine is entitled to their piece of land because they were given it by the conquerors.
Yeah.
Because
by the same token, if they say that Israel is illegitimate because it was made by the British, for example, and they came in there, Palestine also.
That's right, because Britain and France won the battle.
Yeah, and created that sector of land also.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
So what's the role of the Christian? Now, these are independent nations, and I think because Britain said, here you can have that becomes legitimate because they were the conquerors. Otherwise, you can forfeit your rights and give it back to Britain to give to whoever they want.
I mean, the Ottomans aren't coming back from the dead to get their land back.
So what's the role of the Christian? Because obviously the issue here is that there's many civilians being killed and suffering who are not really part of the conflict. You might be labeled Palestinian or Jew, but very often, many people aren't really even involved in the conflict. They've got no say. They just want to raise their families, feed them, teach their children, and that's pretty much it. Just want to live my life. So what's the role of the Christian here?
Yep, Christians should be sympathetic to the plight of any people.
Yeah.
And I feel for the Palestinians because there's 2 million Palestinians there in Palestine. And for the violence of a few people who decided to carry out the attack, who are in control of that area, now the whole country is now being
jeopardized.
And buildings are being knocked down, and people who may have not even caring about this conflict, they just want to live in peace, you know,
Are now displaced,
now
homeless,
displaced,
dead.
homeless. Yeah, and then that causes internal hatreds, and they feel like they have to do something about it. I mean, if your family is getting killed, you'll feel like you might go crazy, you know. So
Because obviously, if I'm a Palestinian family then that loses my loved ones because Israel's revenging Hamas, like, I'm grieved at Israel because they killed my family and my family was not involved, you know, which is really the tragedy in all of this, and vice versa with Israel, that the ones that died, it's like...
Yes, there is the Palestinian Authority that exists there, which is different from Hamas, which has been in negotiation with Israel, which does have a president who's a Palestinian president of that area, you know. And so, yeah, a lot of people are going to suffer because people decided to be terrorists and do that.
What's the role of the Palestinian Authority to Hamas?
Yes.
Should they arrest them?
They have to decide what they want to do. You know, I can't say should they arrest them, but I mean they have to decide what they want to do with that. You know, I know that they're an opposition. Actually, they're an opposition
with Hamas.
Party. Yeah, they're an opposition party. Yeah, and so it's kind of they don't know how to navigate that
because it's a militant group.
Yeah.
So you can start some more chaos within your own
There
nation.
was a civil war at one point between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas.
Tragic. Yeah,
There was a civil war, and so they're in power though, the Palestinian Authority, but. I mean, but Hamas also has a lot of power.
So is this a little bit like ISIS?
I mean, I wouldn't compare it to ISIS, but I'm just saying that there's different factions that are in control. There is a legitimate government there that's not recognized. Like, Hamas is recognized as a terrorist organization by the world, but Palestinian Authority not. They have their own prime minister.
Yeah.
I forget his name. You can look it up. And they are, and there's many people who support them.
Yeah.
And they're going to suffer. They're going to suffer. Their buildings are going to get knocked down. They're besieged, you know.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that means that, you know, maybe the Palestinian Authority starts losing favor with the people too.
Yeah.
You know?
So what do you think the role of the Christian is?
Yeah. The Christian, well, I don't believe in the whole taking of sides thing.
Yeah.
In these sort of conflicts.
Yeah.
You know? A lot of Christians are like, Israel because God's people and you know, all this stuff. Very simplistic understanding. It's a complicated thing. And you can't just immediately take a side like that. We can condone, I think Christians who are in there have an obligation to help their neighbors, you know.
Yes.
To love their neighbors, you know, to help as much as they can. There's plenty of Palestinian Christians also you know, in these areas.
To love their enemies.
Love their enemies, yes. Love their enemies, love their neighbors. Help as much as they can, take people in, you know. And that's the sad thing too. A lot of Middle Eastern countries will not take in Palestinian refugees.
That's tragic.
You know.
Yeah.
And a lot of Christian countries will, though. The Western countries, they do take them in,
you
know. And they would take them in. But there's a lot of Arab countries that will not do that, you know.
There's a racial bias there.
It's not a racial bias. It's more like we want the Palestinians to try and solve their issue without just deferring to their people to us. We want the Palestinians to try and work out a solution. But at the end of the day, there's people suffering.
And they need refuge somewhere.
And they need refuge. Where are they going to go? There's no power. There's no electricity. Their houses are knocked down.
Yeah.
If you're the Christian, you open up your doors, you know.
Yeah.
And you help these people.
Yeah.
And you help Israeli people too. If they got shot or whatever, and you're in Israel now and they got shot by these terrorists, you know, you have to stand against violence, you know.
Whichever way it's coming.
Because both sides are going to do acts of violence.
Yeah.
And Christians can't be like, oh, Israel, you know, because you have the right, because, you know, and who fired first and all this stuff. No, it's like anyone who's suffering, anyone who's being hurt by violence, Christians always support the people that will reconcile towards peace and not towards war, right?
Yeah.
That's a Christian perspective, because Christians were like that. They were persecuted themselves, you know, and...
So are you saying the Christians really need to ignore politics and focus on the mission of Jesus, which is just go and be the hands healing the wounded, you know, feeding the hungry, and nursing
Yes.
people there,
Taking in
regardless of
Palestinians,
taking in
yeah.
refugees, no matter what background, color, race they are,
Yeah.
because that's your role. You're not taking sides.
Yeah,
You're
Christians, like, they had this dilemma during the Civil War as well. There was anyway, that's another topic. But what I was trying to say was, Christian charity is international.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one nation or the other. You help. It's like, if both sides are in conflict, you don't just take a side. It's like, we're working to help those on the ground who are suffering. The innocent people that are suffering.
We're not trying to further suffering.
We're
trying to alleviate.
We're not trying to further Israel's ambitions for more settlements or more territory, or further Palestine's ambitions for the removal of Israel or anything like that. And Christians take sides sometimes. They go, okay, well, actually the Israelis have a mandate because they're the chosen people, and they need to have the territory and build the third temple and all these things, and trying to vouch for one side or the other, But Christians shouldn't be getting into that, The political realm deals with that stuff, The United Nations and
that's right,
and decides how that's going to work out, But Christians shouldn't vouch for a certain side. They're there to help with people who are suffering. That's what charity is about, right? People who are suffering. Good Samaritan, right? He's a Samaritan. The enemy, the Jews don't like the Samaritans. The enemies. And the Christian mandate is help the Samaritan. Help the Samaritan?
Yeah.
Help the dying Samaritan? Yes.
Yeah, because the Jew walked past the suffering man.
Yeah.
So, okay, this is very helpful and insightful. And I really think that, that really is the role of the Christian. I totally agree with you, to be non-partisan. And I think even with national conflicts, we just stand for the biblical principles, but we can sit next to a labor person and do them good. We can sit next to a national person and do them good, and the same in the Israel-Palestinian war.
Your work will not be universal then. Your work will be located
once you pick a side.
You
exclude
Christ
others.
said, "Go to all nations and preach the gospel."
So
every nation, kindred, tongue, and people.
I've got a question for you then to end. So, are the Jews still the chosen people? What? Why do you say that?
They were the chosen people.
They were the chosen people. Why do you say that? Is the Jewish race a superior race?
No. They are not a superior race. They are not. There's no some special magical aura about them.
Yeah.
They are just like anyone else. The Bible calls them, you were the least among the nations, when I called you, You were once a stranger, a foreigner. You were once a slave. You were conceived in iniquity. I found you by the wayside, is what some of the prophets
said. No one wanted you.
No one wanted you. Your mother, it talks about the descendants as being heathen themselves. It's like, check that. That's not the case. You're not the superior race or
God is not racist.
God is not racist. God is not favoritism like that. Every person has the right to accept or reject the message. The Jews need salvation. They need salvation just like every other nation needs salvation. The Jews need salvation. They need to accept Christ.
So did the Palestinians.
The Jews rejected their Messiah. But they can still accept their Messiah. It's not closed for said Jews who will read the prophecies in Isaiah, and see that it's talking about Christ. And there's Christians that can work in Israel for the salvation of the Israeli Jews. And there's Christians who can work in Palestine for the salvation of the Palestinian people. And when they both become saved, these conflicts will
be over.
will fizzle into insignificance. Because our kingdom is not of this world. Our kingdom is in the hereafter. Our kingdom is in heaven.
It's not by blood.
It's not
by color.
Blood, racial creed. Our kingdom is not of this world. Our treasure is in heaven. So our longings and desires are for
heaven.
Abraham didn't possess the land. He was looking.
He left it.
Yes, he went there. Abraham left his homeland, went to the promised land, but where was his heart?
In heaven.
He was looking for a city whose builder was the Lord, who had laid the nation. And so he went there, and he was just a small people, and there were heaps of other people that were there also, He
was content as a foreigner.
He was content
Isaac and Jacob.
Yes, he lived in tents. He was a stateless person. He was content with that because his eyes were focused not on just a promised land, but on the promised land, like, the heavenly
Ultimate
kingdom.
inheritance.
So he was able to be that stateless wanderer, with his eyes fixed on the heavenly kingdom. Does that mean that the promised land belongs to the Babylonians? Because Abraham's from Ur, he's from Babylon. So did Babylon colonize the promised land? No, just kidding.
No, this is a good point. No, this is a good point. Because I think people are still fighting for their identity as though their identity is tied to a piece of land.
Yeah.
And Christianity is saying you're actually aiming much lower than God intended for you, because your identity is much greater. You're the child of God, which means all the earth can be your dwelling place. All the human family can be your family, rather than just kind of taking this window into history and thinking, oh, these people look like me, or this patch of land is where my ancestors began. But actually, Adam goes as far back and he owned the whole thing. And that makes us all human family, and you can live anywhere and serve and love humanity.
Yes, and I just go back to the universal Christian mandate to go to all nations.
Yes.
As soon as you take a side, you're confining your ministry to just that one side.
Yeah.
Israel or Palestine, or furthering their causes. But if you want to be a universal mission with all nations, you have to accommodate for every people.
Yeah.
And that means helping every person and leading them to salvation.
That's right.
And helping any sick or oppressed that are in there
Very
that you
good.
can help. So not the Jews are the chosen people, therefore everything
Let's take their side every time. Yeah.
every time.
So
all people are God's people.
I really like this idea, because then it's like let politics do its thing. But the vast majority of people are not politicians. They're not in government. And our work has a greater effect than what politicians can do, because if we gather together and support the suffering, relieve the oppressed, just make a difference for the people on the ground, that's really where the biggest need is, rather than just launching missiles and the top people
It says,
competing.
blessed are the peacemakers.
Yeah.
How do you become a peacemaker? You have to not take a side. You have
Yeah.
to be a mediator.
Yeah,
That's the whole point behind being a mediator, is you can mediate between two
both
parties.
sides.
And that's how peace comes in.
Very good.
When you take that position.
Very good, man. Excellent. It's been good just getting that history, of the Roman Empire, and all the way to the Ottoman, and how the conflict began. So I really appreciate chatting with you, man. Thanks. Awesome.